Hi, hello everybody. My name's Julie Garland McClellan, and you most likely know me, if you do know me, because of my newsletter, The Director's Dilemma. I sit on some boards myself, so I have a portfolio of 4 boards, all of which have excellent company secretarial support. And I also provide advice to boards on their own effectiveness and operations. Really excited about today's topic. Over to you, Jen.
Kia ora, and hello to everybody. I'm Jen Butler and I manage Absolute Gems. And so we are primarily governance and executive management support team. And my background stems from starting out at the very lowest of the ranks as a receptionist, moving into a secretarial pool and then into PA systems, coming up through as a legal executive and personal assistant to general counsels in both the insurance and banking industries. So that's a little bit about me and how I got into my role, which I've been doing for almost 30 years now, which seems a little bit crazy, but yeah, governance is what I do and what I manage. Over to you, Danica.
Thanks, Jen, and koto, everyone. Hello to all. My name's Danica McLean, as you can see there, and I run a company called Board Administration Services, which, very similar to Jen, provides bespoke governance support for companies, boards, trusts, committees in the form of minute-taking and meeting organisation. Similar to Jen, I've had a corporate career as a board secretary and company secretary, working in the health, education, and insurance and finance sectors. Similar to Jen, I started off as an executive assistant, which incorporated that board secretary role and grew into a governance manager role before taking on a company secretary position for an insurance company, and went on into other insurance companies and a finance provider as their company secretary.
I think perhaps the first thing here for us to talk about is what's the difference? What's that big difference between a company secretary, a board secretary, and what some boards used to call the minutes secretary or the board minute taker? I might flash over to my lovely co-panelists here, Danica and Jen. What are your comments on this?
Oh, Danica, you go ahead for the company secretary, seeing as you've held that role.
Yeah, I'd be happy. So the main difference between my roles as a board secretary and a company secretary is that the company secretary generally is in companies that are a lot larger or are listed and have a lot more regulatory oversight. So in my role as company secretary, I was still responsible for looking after the board and taking all of the minutes of their meetings, organising the papers, and all of the things that a board secretary does. But as well as that, I managed the share register and all of the share trading on the grey market for the company. I was responsible for all of the filings at the company's office. I managed the directors and officers insurance, and it was just a lot more onerous in terms of the number of meetings and committee meetings that the board actually undertook and the things that they were involved in terms of mergers and acquisitions and the regulatory oversight piece.
The majority
Yeah.
of my work is board secretarial work, and here in New Zealand, there's no regulatory oversight for a company secretary. So often the board secretary performs both roles as a board secretary and company secretary. But as Danica said, a financial institution, insurance institution, accounting institution, with those that have higher oversight, legal practice perhaps, to a governing body would often have a company secretary who is heavily involved in the business and the compliance of the business. So they might work with the Commerce Commission or the Privacy Commissioner, etc., as well as the regulatory bodies. But as a board secretary, for the majority of my clients, I will do the company's office return or the incorporated societies or charities returns. I will make sure that they've got a work plan that keeps them compliant, as well as do the minute taking and sorting out the board packs and ensuring that the level of information coming to the board is at that high governance level and not clogging up the board with operations or information and things like that. A minute secretary or a minute taker typically doesn't have a lot to do with preparing the board pack, won't have read the board pack before it comes out often, and generally just comes in, sits down, takes the minutes, creates the minutes with no context, with no general understanding of governance, just literally is recording. It's just recording what happens in that aspect. You'd usually rely on a company secretary or a board secretary to have that governance background and understand the different lenses on which is important to take those minutes. But a minute secretary will literally just record what needs to happen and create a set of minutes for the chair.
And I think historically you'd see minute takers in roles in places like council or courts. On the stenograph, they've got their little minute taking operation, but they don't really have a lot else to do because it's not necessarily governance. It's more a record of what's being stated and what's going on at the meetings. I think we've also just missed out a company secretariat. One of the larger kind of listed companies would do a lot of the reporting through to the stock exchange as well, and do the annual general meeting, which when they've got multiple shareholders becomes quite a complex operation. Is sometimes tied into the general counsel role as well in some of those bigger companies here in New Zealand.
Yeah, it's very common for general counsel and company secretary to be combined. My advice is always do not have any of your directors taking the minutes. They might know what's important, but they can't be good directors and participate if they're minute taking. Minute taking is actually quite an engrossing task. Now, as we've already heard, in Australia, public companies legally have to have a company secretary, and if they don't, they're in breach and they can be fined and the directors can get into trouble. In New Zealand, you don't have to, but a lot of companies actually choose to. There are a few countries that absolutely require you to have a company secretary, which is quite interesting, but they differ on what qualifications that company secretary must have. So for a lot of places, it's having a person who can be held to account for the company's secretarial work, rather than having a professional who is qualified with some certification to be able to do it. So if we look in Australia, to be a company secretary, even if you were company secretary of the Commonwealth Bank, which I think is our biggest company at the moment, must be over 18, must ordinarily reside in Australia. They don't even have to be able to fog a mirror. In New Zealand, you don't have to have one, but if you want to study to become a chartered company secretary, which I always like to have if I can get one, you must be resident in New Zealand, you must be an undergraduate, holder of an undergraduate degree, and you must have significant and relevant experience. But I think sometimes that definition of what's significant and what's relevant can be quite interesting, can I say? Over to my panelists. Who's had some fun with that one?
I certainly have, Julie. When I first started Absolute Gems, I looked at becoming qualified and having that governance experience. I thought, I've actually done the job, but it would be really nice to have a bit of a qualification just to back up. And when you're starting a new business, it's always good to be able to show people that you're dedicated and qualified. And when I approached the organisation to become a chartered secretary, being a legal executive and having 20 years or so governance experience wasn't quite enough for them. So I decided that I'd rather go with the Institute of Directors and follow along and be a qualified director myself.
There's a lovely question. Oh, sorry, Danica.
Yeah, can I just add to that? I think the only place that you can become a chartered secretary here in New Zealand is the Chartered Governance Institute of New Zealand, and they are affiliated with a wider international body that does those chartered qualifications. And I think the chartered secretary, to the previous slide, is a necessity in some countries, and so it's aligned to what's required in some of those other countries. It is considered a postgraduate diploma if you do complete that chartered secretary option, and people people can use it to become a company secretary when they've had absolutely no experience in governance, but hold an undergraduate degree. So for example, I know a marketing manager that did the Chartered Secretary course and then went on to become the company secretary at one of the banks here in New Zealand.
Yeah, and it is quite interesting how people's perceptions change as you go around the world and you talk to the different institutions. I think for me, one of the things I always want is for my company secretary to be a member of a relevant professional institution so that they are getting that constant feed of professional information about what's changing, what regulations are coming in, what people think about holding meetings. So really very important. But the bigger the company, the higher the level of qualifications that I would want. The greater the complexity, the higher the level of qualifications. And sometimes you see companies doing very interesting things. Fiona has asked a question in the Q&A of what is a public officer? Basically, it's somebody who is responsible or accountable for the actions of the organization and who normally has a significant role in decisions that impact the organization. The company secretary in Australia is an officer of the company, as are the directors. So you all have that same standard of care. But I think the interesting thing is to make sure that whoever you've got in the role has the support they need to find the information so that you don't breach any of your rules and regulations. So even in a small not-for-profit, in fact, maybe especially in a small not-for-profit, I like to have a properly qualified company secretary. Fortunately, there are a few of them out there who are such nice people that they will do it without any pay, even though they're professionals. Sandra, the professional institutions in Australia, the Governance Institute of Australia is the go-to place for company secretaries. The Institute of Company Directors is the place that looks after company directors and has a few courses and quite a lot of information that would be of interest. I would recommend being a member of both. I'm a fellow of both, but I'm a qualification junkie, so that's my hobby out in the open. A board secretary is definitely a good and challenging step, whether it's your first role, your second role, or your last role. The pros and cons, you've got to love it. And we'll get on into the typical characteristics. And if that sounds like you, it's a question of, am I the sort of person that's going to love doing this role? If you do, you're possibly an absolute gem, but you're definitely likely to be a better company secretary than someone who's got a list of legal and company secretarial qualifications and certificates on the wall behind them, but hates doing the job, which would be me. I am not the character for company secretarial. Jennifer, you'll get a transcript and you will get a recording, so you don't need to have it repeated. And I know I'm talking fast because there's just so much we want to share with you. In Australia, there are a lot of things that company secretaries have to do. If they're not done, you are in trouble. If the company secretary doesn't do them, the company secretary is in trouble. But if there's no company secretary, it falls to the board. And this is one of the reasons why, even though, yes, you often don't have the luxury of a paid company secretary or a person who only does your company secretarial, you very often see other company officers like your general counsel or your CEO having a joint CEO and company secretary role. They don't always put company secretary on their business card, but they do the job. They're on the hook, which is the bit that for me as a director is very nice. So the typical things company secretaries do is not just all that legal filing. And for those of you who like steak knives, but wait, there's more. They tend to work with the board. And because they're not trying to run, well, if they haven't got a split role, they're not trying to run the company and make all of those commercial decisions. They're really focused on governance and compliance. So they're like the backstop. If any of you have ever seen people playing baseball, there's somebody behind the batter who will catch the ball. Company secretaries are great at that. They'll often give you legal advice, even though they may not always be lawyers, because they get into that information flow. And the other thing is they are usually absolute whizzes at getting through your board admin, making sure your agendas stack up, making sure that your papers go out on the right day or get loaded up to the portal, issuing notices of meetings, drafting and collating, and just making sure that the information that should flow flows and that it's effective. Any comments on that from the two actual company secretaries? This is what I look for a company secretary to do.
Just be careful about saying that they can provide legal advice, because it's
yeah, legally you can't provide legal advice unless you're a lawyer, but they very often tell you what
keep you up to date on changes in legislation and the regulatory landscape. And I think they're often a trusted advisor to the board as well, in terms of kind of governance advice. It's sometimes their role to be the ones keeping upskilled around governance processes and best practice, and they pass that on to the board. A little bit controversial, I'd say that it is their role to also take minutes for the board meeting, though I do know some company secretaries that don't. Often if they're a lawyer or they're an accountant as well, and they've got other roles that they are performing, sometimes they'll have a board secretary in to support them, or an EA or PA.
Yeah, I'll chime in there and say that your board secretary deed, all the ins and outs of all of those clauses, also to understand the legislation that your organisation's governed by. So whether that's health and safety, whether that's the Companies Act or Charities Act, or whichever in your country, or the Corporations Act, is going to be the underpinning value of the organisation which you have to be compliant with. That role falls to the board secretary. So it's not legal advice necessarily that we're giving, it's more legislative advice and compliance advice. And as Daunika said, it's the role of a trusted advisor, someone that you can call on any moment within the board meeting, and they should be able to bring up just out of their head often the clauses which your governing documents relate to, which is really important when you're making some very heavy governance decisions.
It is. And it's a very complicated role. I'm actually quite happy when my company secretary isn't taking the notes, because then they're listening to what we're saying and they're alert to any pitfalls that we might be about to inadvertently walk into. But it's a very nuanced role. I hesitate to use the word mature, but you need somebody who's got that emotional and intellectual power to be able to handle a lot of different relationships with a lot of different people, as well as maintaining confidentiality appropriately. So the company secretary reports to the board, not to the CEO. But most of the time they report through the chair, but their duty is to the board, not to the chair. They often report to the CEO for administrative reporting. And if they are a general counsel or the head of HR or the head of marketing and the company secretary, they have to be able to remember, when am I the CEO's report for this business function? And when am I just reporting to the CEO for things like annual leave and motor vehicle allowances and stuff like that, because I actually report to the board for my general duties. They frequently support and administer all of the board's committees. They do a lot of reporting on behalf of the board, particularly to regulators and stock exchanges. And if you are sending out information to shareholders or to the ACNC, very often that all flows through the company secretary. So it's a very complex role. You need an individual who can really cope with a lot of different complexity. Next slide, please, Sean. And you need them to understand in Australia that because they are a company officer, they must exercise care and diligence. It's there in black and white in the Corporations Act. They must act in good faith and in the best interests of the organization. They cannot use their powers for an improper purpose, and they cannot misuse their information or position. So it is a very onerous duty if you are a legal company secretary. Oh, lovely question from Bev Gibson. Next slide, please. Electronic minute takers. Whoa, we can't wait to get to that one. I don't think the AI is there yet, is the short answer. New Zealand is different, but there are still some specific things that you might want your company to do. Danica, do you want to leap in and address this one?
Yeah, so the New Zealand Companies Act is similar to the Australian Corporations Act in terms of directors' duties. Jen, you had this point here around the professional advisor under Section 138(1)(b). Did you want to talk to that?
Yeah, so there is as we talked at the really beginning of this webinar, there's a difference between a company secretary, board secretary.
Keeps dropping out here.
And minute taker. There's also a real difference about whether you're professional, but whether it's an employee of the organization, most often that the CEO's EA, or maybe even the CFO or the CFO's EA that would take board minutes if it's internal. Now, if you are relying on a professional board secretary like Danica and I, then we actually fall under Section 138 of the Companies Act, and here in New Zealand anyway, which says that the board can rely on advice given by professional advisors. So that covers you there. But however, your board secretary or your company secretary should be included in your directors and officers insurance, and they should be named just like any other director, because they too can be held responsible for the professional advice that they're giving to the board.
I think it's just important to note that it is law that minutes are taken of all shareholder meetings here in New Zealand. So you can't get away from that aspect and decide that you just don't need a company secretary or a board secretary, because you at least need someone to be there taking the minutes at a bare minimum.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Julie's point was spot on when she said that she doesn't like to have directors taking minutes, because it is so difficult. As a director, you are there to provide your valuable knowledge and advice and direction of the company. And to be able to do both jobs, Danica and I, we're using a lot of skill and expertise in taking minutes at that board level. And I can't, and I know we've probably both done for not-for-profits, the role of both. And it's really difficult to juggle. It really is. So you want the expertise of your director.
Yeah, and if it's an executive or director that's taking the minutes, it's inevitable that their own biases will creep into those minutes. So when you've got an independent minute taker, the minutes are very objective, and that can be very important at times.
Absolutely.
Yep. As I said, really difficult role. You must trust them. If they are not a trusted advisor, you've got the wrong person in the role. And it doesn't matter what certificates they've got behind them. We all have heard of people who were very well qualified but did the wrong thing. I was horrified. I watched a documentary about Carlos Ghosn and how he escaped from Japan and went into exile. But everybody they talked to said, oh, I never liked him. He was a brilliant executive. He made a lot of money, but never trusted him. Like, why on earth did you make him your president? Do not do that with anybody. You really should be able to trust, particularly at officer level, the people around you. And the company secretary or the board secretary is an officer. They are people upon whose professional advice you rely as a director. So really important. I think it is more important to get somebody with the right character than it is to get somebody who's trained. In fact, I did one board performance review for a company, and they had this amazing structure where they had a professionally qualified contracted in company secretary reporting to an unqualified but long-serving employee with an operations background. who was officially the company secretary, and she was officially the assistant. And I looked at this and scratched my head a little bit. And so I had a word with the chair and I said, what's going on here? And he said, the last review we did, the reviewer said, oh, your company secretary is not up to standard. You've grown, you're too big now. You need a better person. Get rid of him and hire someone with these qualifications. And we thought, no, that's not the way we treat our valued staff. This person's absolutely the right sort of person. We'll give him education and support. And he was actually doing a course, a master's in governance, which picks up the company secretarial qualification on the way through. But they were actually educating him and supporting him with a properly qualified person with a view to when he got qualified, that person would move on, because they said it's a terrible message to send to our staff that no matter how good and how dedicated you are, we'll kick you out and replace you with a stranger simply because you haven't got a piece of paper. And I thought, wow, I'd like to work for you. Oh, I do, but only as a contractor. So it is, I think, really those quality relationships with your company secretary, and you can get education if you need it. Over to you guys.
I'd say
In-house or contract? What do you prefer?
Sorry, Julie's going to add, like, you also need someone with confidence and a little
Mhm.
bit of resilience in the role too. They need to be able to put their hand up and say to directors around the board table and not be intimidated if there's something where they're misstepping or need a little bit of advising.
Yeah,
100%.
absolutely. And the directors need to listen.
That's about respect around the board table, and we often have a wee in-house joke. It's no longer the 1950s.
Not there to bring in the tea and coffee.
The board secretary or the company secretary no longer 2 a.m. with the cups of tea and biscuits, and doesn't sit at a separate table away from the big boys making all the big bad decisions. The company secretary is a really valuable role. It is a role that has an in-depth knowledge of your company, of your organizations, of the governance structure and the compliance. And it will probably be as well slightly biased because we recognize the value of independence in the boardroom, making sure that that your minutes have lots of different lenses put over top of them, particularly that they are for the board, not for the operations or management team.
Yeah, I think I'd chime in here, in-house company versus contract. There are benefits to both. In-house, you get that innate knowledge of the ins and outs of the business, and you understand the politics and some of the things that as an outsider you sometimes miss out on, and you don't necessarily have that context around the boardroom. Arguably, it's not necessarily relevant if you're being completely objective in your minute taking when you come in to attend. The contract option is always going to be more cost effective because you're not paying for someone full time, you're just paying for that kind of meeting support and the governance advice, which tends to be a lot less than a full-time role. And you're getting access to a lot of expertise that you don't necessarily have in someone that's just worked in one or two companies, because people like Jen and I have a large breadth of boards that we've served. And so we get the experience and we get to witness the good and the bad, and we learn from all of them.
Yep. Over to the audience. There's some great questions in the chat. Rotating minute taking and the CEO chairing the meeting. What would we recommend to improve the structure and roles? Wow, an Australian private SME, 4 executive directors and 1 NED. One, I would not rotate the minute taking. I would find somebody. There are outsourced minute takers that you can get, even if you don't want to bring in a company secretary, bring in somebody to take your minutes, or use the CEO's secretary to take your minutes. And then the chair or the directors can edit those. But if you've only got 5 people around that table, having one of them distracted by taking minutes instead of contributing, you've lost 20% of your firepower. And if it's a different 20% at every meeting, that could cost you dearly. So I would be very careful with that. All right, Jen and Danica?
Yeah.
Good. Would I recommend the AICD director course? I'll declare a conflict of interest, but having written large amounts of it and having delivered it over the last 25 years, yes,
Yeah.
I would. But if you want to be a company secretary, do the company secretary's courses. If you want to be a director, do the director's courses. There is some overlap, there is some common knowledge, but always remember that specific qualifications for specific roles are really good. You can see me deferring to Jen and Danica because they've got knowledge that I don't have. If we were talking about directors, they would hopefully defer to me a little. So as CEO and nominated company secretary, what are my views on the use of AI to capture minutes? I do not like it. I think at the moment the technology is not quite there. I also worry, which AI are you using? Is it your own internal AI that's ring-fenced, that lives on your server, that only has been educated on your board stuff, plus background legislation and regulation? Or are you using ChatGPT that might be storing it anywhere? I know they say that what you ask it and the answers it gives you won't be used by other people, but I'm not 100% sure about that because it is learning all the time. It is a learning model. And I just find at the moment, people understand much better than AI. When I say the government is doing this, they never get it wrong and think the governance is doing this. But AI doesn't understand what it's doing. It's just using the most likely words in the most likely sequences. It's not really hearing and understanding what we say. And if you're using a non-specifically trained board AI, it will not understand the context. It assumes whatever you talked about most is the most important thing. Whereas sometimes a tiny little thing on the agenda, okay, so in our in-camera, we'll have a talk about the CEO's role. That might be the most important comment at your meeting, but the AI might leave it out because it was so short. So really be careful with AI. If you have to, I don't like recording meetings. Those of you who to have a good laugh, Google leaked board video and just have a look at how many are out there and how bad and embarrassing some of them are. And you will never want to record again. Jen,
Dropping.
you dropped out.
So,
Confidential meet strategic things and in
sorry,
camera.
my apologies. I don't like it. I really don't like AI. I've tried, I think, 2 separate different types of AI to record minutes. And as Julie says, the most talked about thing is what it thinks is the most important thing. Really good to try it and see how it works. But again, everything that you record is discoverable. Really not cool. So if you are using AI or you are recording your meetings after the minutes are approved, I highly recommend you destroy those, because particularly if you're using it all the time, directors become quite complacent and they may talk about things that perhaps they shouldn't talk about around the table. And Julie, as a director, I'm sure you've seen plenty of that. And they become complacent and forget that there's a recording going on. So I always recommend that if you are recording, it gets destroyed as soon as the chair has approved the minutes.
Yep.
And that if you are using AI, same thing, be really careful. Dawnika's actually, I will defer to her in terms of AI. She's really onto it with that. So do you want to have a chat about AI in the governance space?
Yeah, I think we're running out of time. There's a lot to discuss there, and I think there are different ways of approaching it. I think some of those AI minute-taking softwares like Otter AI or Fireflies.ai can be helpful for kind of ELT meetings or project steering committee meetings because they can summarize action points and overall discussion themes, but they are not there yet in terms of picking up the nuances of board meetings, like Julie touched on.
Yeah.
Doesn't cope well with people talking over the top of each other. And it takes a very kind of standardized, what I'd say like American approach to what it thinks those summaries need to be. It's not necessarily fit for purpose for the country that you're in or the market that you're in or the industry, though it is a moving feast and things are progressing very quickly and these products are trainable. If you've got something like Microsoft Copilot that's within your ecosystem that's going to be secure, you can play around with the different kind of mechanisms within that. Things like Teams can do summaries of transcripts from meetings, but it's very unlikely that you'd have all directors within that same ecosystem. So you're not going to have the security that you'd have if it was just all employees in that meeting.
Yeah, and there's a case going through the courts at the moment in America where 2 directors were using 2 different softwares to record notes of the meeting. They are different from each other and they are different from the official minutes. I've read a few of the transcripts because I'm really interested, but the judgment isn't out yet. But it's looking really bad. They've created a challenge to the authenticity and reliability of their minutes. Now, we've been talking about recording. You are going to get the recording of this afterwards. And I think one of the things you should put in your feedback is let's come back and talk about AI because it's such a hot topic. And I wish we could stay because we could talk about AI from now until 5 o'clock in the afternoon, but Sean is not going to let us. So over to you, Sean. You please reach out to us. We will get back to you with answers to the questions. And we hope we will see you again at another webinar soon.